Okay. Hi, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Today we'll be covering preventative maintenance on the YSI 2900 series. Just a couple of things before we get started. Feel free to use the question and answer function in Zoom. We'll answer as many questions as we can closer to the end. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand in a few days. You'll receive a link in the post-webinar email. And with that, we can kick off the presentation and I'll turn it over to Ben Sutter to get things started.
Thank you very much, Heather. We are here on the Avoid Downtime YSI 2900 series webinar. I'd like to do a quick presentation, or rather a quick introduction of myself. My name is Ben Sutter. I am the product manager of this product line. I have a bachelor's of science in ACS chemistry. I have about 10 years of experience with the life science line of products. I did start my career here in tech support, and I do find myself as the product manager of Xylem Lab Solutions currently. So I have quite a bit of background with this. Somebody else with a lot of background on this instrument is Jason Baxter, our bench repair supervisor. He has a master's in geological sciences. He has been a repair technician with YSI for a while now, for better than 11 years. He is our primary service person for a wide variety of product lines that we have here, and he is a lifelong motorcycle enthusiast. He'll tell you all about it if you give him a chance. But we're talking about today, though, we're talking about the 2900. So who is this webinar for? Who is it intended for? Well, it's for people who want to know how to better perform service for their instrument. It is for existing customers. If you want to learn some tips and tricks, if you want to do your preventive maintenance faster or better, or potential users who want to see just how little upkeep there is for the 2900D series biochemistry analyzers. So if you fall into any of those camps, welcome, and we're excited to show you what we have here today. To give you an idea of what we're actually talking about, for those who are newer to the instrument, for a quick overview, here is the YSI 2900D Biochemistry Analyzer. Here's some of the features of this instrument. It measures sugars. You can see there's a large list of sugars here, and that is what we measure when we're working with the 2900D. We do have a nice list of features. It is fast and accurate, so it does work very quickly. You don't need very much sample, typically about 25 microliters. And there's little to no preparation you need to do on those samples because it does have enzymatic selectivity. It does have a user-friendly touchscreen, very easy to pick up and use. You can do up to 96 samples at a time if you use a 96 well plate. You can also use other well plates or sampling methods. It has very flexible data handling options. There's onboard help and training. There's videos you can look at. There's a help menu. There's a lot of, you don't have to necessarily get the manual out to run the instrument. And it's very clogging resistant with a sipper needle that is designed to get your sample and move it from place to place easily. That's not the only product we have in this product line, however. We also have three others in this family. The 2500 is glucose and lactate only. It is a not as full of a featured instrument. It does not have a CFR part 11, for instance, and it only does glucose lactate, but is a very similar instrument. The 2950D is all available chemistries that we have, plus ISEs, and that one can do up to 6 chemistries at a time. And recently, we have our newest member of the family, the 2900C. The YSI 2900C Biochemistry Analyzer is available currently only in the US, but we're working to make it available in other markets. That one is an FDA Class 2 registered instrument. And that one only does glucose now, but lactate will be forthcoming. Now, this webinar will be using the 2900D as the representative instrument. That is our flagship instrument. But this 6-month preventive maintenance applies equally well to the YSI 2500 or the YSI 2900C biochemistry analyzers. The 2950D follows most of the same steps with some additional steps as well, but today's presentation will still cover a good deal of the 2950D's preventive maintenance. Real quickly, so we can know how the instrument works, here's a diagram of the functional portion of that. There's a polycarbonate layer that acts as a filter, prevents the enzymes layer from being exposed to the sample. The immobilized enzyme layer then contains an enzyme of a biological catalyst, so it's not used up during this chemical process. This chemical process lyses a sugar, that is, it breaks into two pieces while liberating hydroxide ion. That hydroxide ion can then make its way past the final layer, the cellulose acetate layer. That layer is porous only to the hydrogen peroxide, and that gives you the signal needed proportional to the amount of sugar in your sample. Here is a quick component overview. So when we're actually looking at it, when we are into the instrument, we know what we're talking about. The big parts we're going to be looking at here are going to be the sipper, the waste bottle, the buffer bottle, and the calibrator bottles. The USB port and the touch panel and things like that aren't really factoring in to our preventive maintenance today. Here's another view that's probably going to be the view you're going to be looking at most of the time when you're actually performing this service. The sipper pump is on the back wall there. You can see our level sensing hookups on the back wall there. We have our sample chamber, which we'll be doing a lot of work on, and our peristaltic pumps down below. Keep in mind that those colors are a little bit different than you may see on the peristaltic pumps from our live presentation, but they do exactly the same thing. All right, let's do a quick overview of what maintenance looks like when we're not doing our 6 month, because it's not always you're waiting 6 months and then you just work on your instrument. You are going to do some less intensive checks throughout your time with the instrument. So we have daily, weekly, monthly, and 6 month maintenance that we want to do. And we're going to go through all those right now. The daily checks, you want to check your fluids. Make sure your fluids are topped off, make sure they're fresh, make sure they're not expired. And that should be pretty cursory, should not take much time. Check for leaks. As you run your fluids, make sure that there's no bubbles going in anywhere. Make sure that there's no water or condensation anywhere that you can detect. You can check your membrane integrity and check your linearity. Now, when you run these, you're going to get linearity standards and you're going to get an FCN solution, and those are both intended to check the functionality of your instrument. While those aren't completely necessary for the function of the instrument, I would highly, highly recommend that every day you do that to make sure that your instrument is reading linearly and to make sure that your membrane is intact. So those are daily checks. Every week, and it may not be every week, but in general, the weekly is about how often you should check this, is that you should change your membranes if they don't meet the criteria that are on the screen right now. If its sensitivity can't get up to where it needs to be, that is above 5 nanoamps or so, then it probably needs to be replaced. If it has very low linearity and it's not able to keep that linearity, it's also time to give that a replacement. Every enzyme, every type of sugar that we measure will have its own interval. That's all clearly listed in the manual, so make sure you go by those guidelines. And if you notice it's dipping below these criteria, please take actions and replace those membranes. Now it's time for our monthly check. This is, you're going to change out your calibration solution. A lot of those are on 28 days, if not 14 days. So it's a good time every month to change those calibration solutions out. You want to flush your calibration tubing with 1% hypochlorite, that is bleach, and then DI water, or the cleanest water you have available, at least distilled. Please do not use tap water on this. And then you want to do the same thing with the buffer bottles and caps with the 1% hypochlorite. And then same thing, you want to use the cleanest water you have to flush that afterwards. However, these are all relatively easy, relatively fast, and I don't think it warranted an entire webinar. The 6 month preventive maintenance, however, is something that I think could use a little bit more highlighting. So this is the big one, the focus of the webinar. This preventive maintenance is very valuable in that it'll keep your YSI 2900 series analyzer in the best possible condition for years to come. There's a lot of steps in performing a 6 month PM, and today we're going to show you how easy it is to perform live. So we have split this into 3 sections today for clarity. Listed here are all the steps that will be needed to be completed for the 6 month PM. We have put this into 3 sections, and we're going to keep on jumping back to me as we go through. So we're going to try to keep it nice and tidy for you. Now, we do have some tools that you should have when you're doing this. You should have a nice pair of tweezers. You should have a Phillips head screwdriver. You'll need 2 Allen wrenches because 2 are slightly different size. There's 3 32nds and a 7/64 Allen wrench that you'll require. And maybe pliers. If a certain piece is on there very tight, you may need pliers, but that is generally optional. especially if you take the steps that you're going to learn later today. All that being said, I think we've set ourselves well to actually take a look at this preventive maintenance that we've been talking about. So let's move on to our first section here. 6-month preventive maintenance. This is going to be part 1. We're going to clean our sample and waste chambers, and we're going to clean our bottles and caps. Without further ado, I'm going to shift the focus over to Jason. And Jason, I'll set that over to you.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's attending this webinar. Thanks for your time to check in with us and better educate yourselves, and thanks for letting us help you. So when it's time to do your PM kit, you're going to buy the entire PM kit. It's going to come in a box. Inside of the box will be a multitude of Ziploc bags, each containing its own label. There will be one large bag that will show chamber 1 tubing pack, which we'll get to in a little while. There will also be an individual bag that contains the sample needle. There will be another individual bag that contains the sipper pump O-rings. And lastly, there will be a bag that will say biochamber number 1. This contains all the O-rings and the stir bar for your sample chamber. So what I like to do, my approach is just to start with the device. I like getting things soaking first to minimize my downtime while I'm doing a PM. And then once I have everything soaking, I just simply go bag by bag and until I don't have any bags left over. The first time you do one, it can be kind of intimidating, but once you do this, it's a very straightforward job. To begin, you're going to have to unplug the device, turn the device off. That way you don't run into any mechanical issues. You want to remove your outermost panel. You just put your fingers in here and lift up and out. Set this to the side. You want to remove your bottle rack from the side of the device. You should just be able to lift up and pull it away. Once you have the bottle rack removed, go ahead, just since you're here, and remove your 2 calibrator lines. These are just push to connect. Oh, hang on. There we go. Sorry for that. These are push to connect or pull to remove. Same with the buffer line. And lastly, with your waste line. And now what I want to do is I want to remove the sample chamber, the waste chamber, and the sipper pump housing. To do this, you're going to need your 3 30-second Allen wrench. Start by removing your 3 thumb screws on the top. All 3 thumb screws are the same, so there's no reason to worry about which one goes where. Remove these 3, set them to the side. At this point, you can lift the sample chamber up, the clear component. It will lift up and off. Unscrew your temperature sensor, which is your white lead at the top. The thumb screw will just simply unscrew, and then you can simply lift the temperature sensor out. You'll notice there's an O-ring on the end of the temperature sensor. That O-ring is removed and discarded. Set your temperature sensor down. Remove your 2 enzyme probes. Notice on the 2900s and 2950s, pretty much all these models, they're all equipped with 2 enzyme probes per sample chamber. One thing you're going to hear me say a lot on this webinar is probe A is on the left and probe B is on the right when you're looking straight at the reaction chamber. So unscrew the probes, just simply unscrew. Once you have the nut unscrewed, you can pull the probe out. Set this sample chamber off to the side. Remove the small O-ring that goes between the sample chamber and the waste chamber. This O-ring can be discarded. Take your 3 30-second Allen wrench and remove, there are a total of 3 bolts in here that hold the waste chamber down onto the deck. Once you have these 3 bolts removed, set them to the side. My personal suggestion is to set them very close to where you had the 3 wing nuts that hold the sample chamber on. So I'm going to tip this over and all 3 of these screws are going to fall out. So there we are. At this point, you can disconnect your tubing. This one automatically unhooked itself. just pull to connect. The waste tubing is simply a pull to connect and pull to disconnect. I want to emphasize, do not twist this fitting. If you twist this fitting, you can accidentally shear the waste fitting off, and then you've just introduced some new problems that you can avoid simply just by pulling. The waste tube can be discarded. Lastly, take your same 3/32 Allen wrench, remove the 2 bolts that hold your sipper pump assembly onto the back wall of the device. Once you have both bolts loosened, the only thing holding this sipper pump assembly onto the device right now is my hand. So you just want to make sure you have your hand ready, so that way you can remove this as a cartridge and simply pull it off. Tip it forward to capture your 2 bolts. One thing to note is these 2 bolts for the sipper pump assembly are slightly different length than the 3 bolts that are used for the waste chamber. So when you set them aside, make sure you put them into 2 different groupings. Make reassembly a little bit easier. Oops, I'm terribly sorry for that. Had an earthquake here. Take your sipper pump assembly, remove these 2 lines that are coming off. Notice that the rear line goes down behind the panel and the front line goes up toward your sample needle. And again, these are just pull to connect. Now hold the clear part of the sipper pump. We call this the sipper pump housing. Hold the housing with one hand and the white body with another hand. Pull and twist to separate it. Take your sipper pump body, set it down momentarily. You're going to want to take your waste chamber, your sipper pump housing, and your sample chamber. Put these into a container that has 10:1 hypochlorite or bleach solution, and let them soak for at least 15 minutes. Anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes is just fine. So we're going to set these off into our bucket so they can soak, so they will get themselves cleaned up. Lastly, almost lastly, when you're taking your sipper pump housing, or I'm sorry, your sipper pump body apart, you'll notice that there's a small orange O-ring at the front, and then there's a black spacer. If I pull these out somewhat, you'll notice there's a second orange O-ring behind. To remove this, simply take off the one orange O-ring and discard. One very important aspect is this black spacer. This black spacer is not included in the PM kit, but it is very critical to the function of the device. So please set this aside somewhere where you can find it and not knock it down the sink or onto the floor or anything of that sort. Lastly, you can hold this chromed part of what I call the T-bar, and you can usually screw the sipper pump body in, and now it's exposed to the second O-ring. Remove the second O-ring. Last, take off this black O-ring by pinching and pushing upward, and then you can walk it off. I want to advise, you want to try to do this by hand. If you use something metal like a pair of tweezers or a screwdriver or something, you can end up gouging this white plastic body, and then you're going to introduce a leak where you didn't have a leak in the past. So you want to be very sensitive with that part. The black O-ring you can discard. Set this to the side, ideally with your 2 bolts that hold that assembly together. Lastly, part that confuses everybody is your bottle caps. To remove the bottle caps, you'll notice you got 2 here for the calibrator, 1 for the buffer and 1 for the waste. The 2 caps for the calibrator are identical, so I'm just going to take one apart instead of all 4. The buffer part comes apart the same way, the waste comes apart the same way. Unscrew your threaded retaining ring, lift your cap out, and now we have this gold fitting that connects to your cap. So all you need to do is unscrew your cap from that gold fitting, and now you can take your bottle caps, all 4 of them, put them in the same bleach water solution you're using to soak your sample chamber and your waste chamber and your sipper pump housing. At that point, you can be ready to move on to the next stage. The next stage is going to be replacing all the tubing that's behind this panel. And I'm going to hand it back over to Ben Sutter so he can give you some info.
Thanks, Jason. That was section 1. Now, a lot of times, right after we do a PM, in my experience as a tech support, I've heard a lot of different things that happen directly after. So as Jason goes through this, I'm going to talk about a few things that may happen after that you may notice. As that occurs, you can kind of nip them in the bud by just knowing exactly what you're looking for. So here's some things that happen after the preventive maintenance that you may want to look for. If the module leaks after you put it all together, you want to make sure that your O-ring is correctly set into place on the base. We will watch Jason actually perform that action later. We want to assure that the thumb screws are all tightened properly. If those aren't all tightened properly, it will make a seal with the O-ring and we'll have leaks. Make sure that the O-ring is present on the temperature sensor. I'm sure Jason will remind you of that one because that is probably the easiest to forget O-ring. And the second thing that could potentially happen is your stir bar is not spinning. This typically doesn't happen right after preventive maintenance, but it happens often enough. I wanted to mention it. Sometimes if for whatever reason, sugar or salts or other biological matter collects at the bottom of the sample chamber, sometimes it can be glued there. That is the little tiny stir bar can be glued to the bottom. You just need to get in there with a thin tool, dislodge it, and it will work just fine afterwards. Those are my follow-on tips. Next thing we're going to talk about is going to be changing out the tubing, which is one of the most important parts, in my opinion, of the PM. I'm going to send it back over to Jason, and I'll let you take care of it.
Very well. Thank you, Ben. So to begin changing out your tubing, you're going to need your second Allen wrench, the larger of the two, the 7/64 Allen wrench. You have 2 bolts that need to be removed. You'll notice these are very short. Sometimes they like to disappear. Just, again, set them to the side where you can find them. Once you have your 2 bolts removed, you can grab this panel, pull it out toward you, and then lift up. And we now have all of the peristaltic pumps exposed. So we can see starting from here to here, we have calibrator 1A, calibrator 1B, and our buffer. You'll notice that the calibrators are a red color. The caps are identical between the two, and the buffer is blue. So it's very easy to remember, at least in my opinion it is. And if you follow, just to pick on calibrator 1A, you may remember from a moment ago, I said A is on the left, B is on the right. A is on the left, B is on the right. And if I follow my outlet tube up, that one is the one that plugged into the left-hand side port. So at this point, you can just draw your tubes down. So we should have 3 free ends right now. And then you can pull your other ends of your tubing through here. One thing of note that we'll see again at reassembly is each one of these lines has a label on it that will identify what terminal it should attach to. So it makes life, we made that a lot easier. All the tubing in the PM kit is pre-cut, so there's no guessing, there's no guesswork, there's no magic. It's very straightforward. To remove these peristaltic pumps, I like to put my index finger down at the bottom of the cap, and then I hook my thumb in on the top, just of the red portion, and I can pull it out, and you should hear a faint click as it lets go. For the calibrator, when you remove it, pardon me, once you remove the calibrator pump, you should notice it has these 2 white rubberized inserts inside of this cap. Sometimes these inserts like to get somewhat adhesive and they will actually stick to the tubing here. If they do stick to the tubing, that's not a problem. Just remove them from the tubing and press them back into the cap. They just nest in. There's no glue. There's no snapping. They just sit in place. But it's very important to have them. Repeat for calibrator 1B. Make sure we have our inserts. We do. And then lastly, the buffer, pull it off. You'll notice the buffer does not have inserts. That's on purpose. At this point, I highly suggest finding some gloves. These peristaltic pumps and the tubing within uses a silicon-based grease. It's really nasty. It's real slippery. It's real slimy. It's not necessarily toxic, but it's really difficult to wash your hands up afterward, and then you leave fingerprints all over the device. So once you have your gloves on, you simply grab hold of the tubing. I put an index finger on the peristaltic wheel, the white part in the middle, and then I just pull that out, discard, pull this out, discard, pull this out, discard. If during removal you pull one of these peristaltic wheels out, no great deal. They just sit on a plus sign insert into the actual pump body. So all you have to do is just set them back in. The only thing holding them in is gravity. And all three of the wheels are the same. So if you pop all three of them out, you don't have to worry about which one goes where. So here we go, the meat and potatoes, as we like to say, of this device. When you open up the chamber 1 tubing pack, you're going to have this one tubing is not labeled. It's for your waste. It's very self-explanatory. I will usually take it and just install it straight into the waste bottle so I don't lose it. So inside of the large bag, aside from the waste tubing, we have 3 small bags. Buffer pump number 1, calibrator pump 1A, calibrator pump 1B. So we have each one individually bagged. What I'm in the habit of doing is just opening up one bag at a time and getting my work area prepared. And sometimes the Ziploc bag doesn't want to open like this one. So you'll notice we have a short side. Each one of these tubes will have a long side and a short side. This is important because the long side is the side that goes through the chassis and out to the bottle. As I like to say, I call it the bottle, the intake side or the inlet side. That side is always on the right-hand side of each one of these pumps. So what I do is I take the tubing, I just opened up the bag for 1B. So I'll set the tubing on the bag for 1B immediately in front of pump 1B. Try to make my life a little easier here. I do the same. The next bag is calibrator 1A. You'll notice calibrator 1A has a small silicone grease packet inside. That's going to come in. You're going to need that here in just a little bit. And lastly, the buffer pump. Again, with its own grease pack. So this is where you really need to wear gloves, or if you have some kind of cutting device or a pair of scissors, that's great. Otherwise, you can just tear open the end of the blister pack. Take a small amount of this grease. Actually, for the buffer pump, you use about half of a packet. Set this grease to the side. It's going to come in handy later. You're going to want to smother and smear this grease all around in this tubing. So you definitely want to wear gloves. Otherwise, you're going to leave your fingerprints everywhere for the next day. So you'll remember the inlet side is on the right-hand side. So what I will do is I will start by putting this into the peristaltic pump. I make sure that I have about an even amount of tubing sticking up on each side. What's really important is on this one, on the buffer pump, you'll notice if you look at these up close, you'll notice the inlet side has a square fitting on the top of it. The outlet side is a very rounded fitting. What I like to do is I have the rounded fitting sticking up above the pump shoulder before installation. When I install these, you'll notice the inside of the cap has a small hole in the center of it, and you'll notice the peristaltic pump wheel has a post that sticks out. All you have to do is line up the cover on top of the post, and then I will gently grab a hold of the square fitting on the buffer pump and lift it upward, and that will give me clearance to install my buffer cap. A lot of times these caps will go on with a nice resolute click, but this one's not wanting to cooperate today. There we are. So now my buffer pump's done. Yes, it's very greasy. We're going to clean that up here in a little bit. Next, I'm going to take my packet. Now that I'm covered with grease, I can't open it. Pardon me for just a moment. My non-conforming cutting device here. So we take our second blister pack, maybe. It goes this way during the webinar. So again, you want to use about half of that grease pack on 1B and the other half on 1A. That's the reason we only give you one grease pack for the 2 calibrator tubes. The expectation is you're going to use about half of this packet on A, half of the packet on B. Again, slather it up, Make sure the inlet side is on the right-hand side. You'll notice the calibrator lines are a bit longer than the buffer line. This is by design. What I look to see is that these two ends of the tubing that are coming up out of the top of the pump are roughly at the same height. As long as they're close to the same height, you'll be just fine. We're going to do likewise with B. There we are. Now at this point is when I'll usually take my gloves off. Again, we have a hole in the center. We have a post down on the bottom. Line it up. Here, a nice resolute snap. At least I hope you did. Your tubing is now more or less finished. What I like to do at this point is I'm going to take the 3 inlet tubes, hold them in one hand, and get some IPA. Just soak a towel, a cleaning towel. This way I can remove most of the grease off of the tubes. We'll take these 3, route them up through a hole right here in the chassis. Please go through. There we are. So now I have all 3 of my tubes ready to go over to my bottles at reassembly. These other 2 tubes, I'm just going to leave, these other 3 tubes, we're just going to leave free for the moment. If you want, you can take this very skinny buffer tube, route it up through the same hole, and just let it fall over toward the back side of the instrument. Now you're going to take your IPA, thoroughly douse it up. If you want to use gloves, terrific, I encourage that. And now you're just going to wipe up the excess grease off of this device. At this point, you're actually done with the tubing, and we can hand it back over to Ben so he can begin talking about the next section.
Thank you, Jason. Just 1 second while I get this back up again. And there we are. So that's how we get that tubing back on there. Here's some things that we do notice after that happens, after you change out that tubing. And this is probably the most common thing where we receive tech support calls. So take extra special care when going about this portion. If you notice bubbles in the line, this is a big one. You don't want any leaks in there. So assure there's no gaps in the tubing. When you do eventually reattach these in the next step, you want to make sure they're on all the way. You want to assure that the large tubing in the peristaltic pump is pushed all the way back. When you saw Jason push those down in the back, down at the bottom, the big part of the tubing, the part that's pictured here, you want to make sure that's all the way back under that white wheel. The more snug it is back there, the better. And you also want to make sure that those caps are fully seated that go on top of them. If they're not, then it could affect how much fluid goes through there, and that could affect performance. So we want to make sure those do click as he indicated. Now, if the dispensing amount of fluid appears to be low after we perform our service, you want to check the O-rings and the sipper pump and make sure that those are present, because sometimes that can cause a leak and cause too little fluid to be dispensed. And sometimes fresh O-rings can stick after installation, and you have to move that piston a little bit to unstick it. Fresh rubber can be very, very sticky until you get it to move that first time. We're going to see that in the next step here. That being said, those are my follow-on tips. The next thing we're going to be looking at is the conclusion of the 6-month preventive maintenance, more or less. We are going to be looking at replacing your sipper, cleaning your enzyme probes off, and replacing that stir bar. I'll send it back to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Ben. So at this point, you can do this in just about any order you want to. I always like to start with the small things, work my way toward the big things. So you have less things, you have fewer items on your mind. So you're going to gather all your things out of your bleach water and rinse them accordingly. We like to rinse in either distilled or preferably DI water to make sure everything's clean. You get all the bleach residue off of your components. I generally like to start with the sipper pump assembly first. So you take your bag that's marked Zipper Pump O-ring pack. Have 3 O-rings total inside. So you'll take your first O-ring. You'll notice there's a distinct way that this goes together. You have one small O-ring, your black plastic spacer that hopefully you didn't lose or didn't disappear on you. You'll notice it sits on very loose. There's no mechanical friction holding that spacer into place. And then your second O-ring. It has to be assembled in this order. If you have it backward, or if you're missing an O-ring, or if you're missing the spacer, this pump assembly is not going to function. So take these, just push them all the way down. Lastly, take my large black O-ring, whoops, and just roll it over and walk it into place. I will generally take this T-bar and unscrew it a handful of turns. It'll make reassembly and start up a lot easier. So I have my zipper pump body, my zipper pump housing, the clear part being the housing. And you'll notice we have 2 what I call outlet needles. I make sure the outlet needles are pointing up at the ceiling, and I just reinstall. Sometimes you have to twist it slightly to get it to go back together. Sometimes it'll just snap together like this one did. Find your 2 bolts for your zipper pump housing. I will usually put these into place just so I have one less thing to chase around. I make sure I know where my 3/32 Allen wrench is. At reassembly, you'll notice the backside of the zipper pump has this, what I call the T-bar on it. When you look back inside of the chassis, where did it go? There it is. When you look back inside of the chassis, you'll notice the driver also has a cutout that lines up with the T-bar. So just take a moment, and if it's not lined up, just line it up by hand, however you need to do it. So I'm using my hand to hold this into place. I take my Allen wrench, I snug this down. It's a little easier to do it when you're just in person and not on the camera, because you don't have to think about where your hands are. If it looks awkward, that's just because of the way that I move. So now our zipper pump housing is reinstalled. There's no torque spec. You just need it to be about finger tight. So you don't have to go crazy. You don't need a torque wrench. You don't need anything of this sort. If you remember from our last adventure, we have our thin outlet line coming out of our buffer pump going up here. You're going to want to take the free end and connect it to the rear outlet tube on your zipper pump housing. I wish there were a better way to show this on camera. I'd be happy to after the fact. So now we've got our zipper pump reassembled. Moving on, we're going to go to the BioChamber #1 service pack. This pack has 3 O-rings and 2 stir bars. We give you 2 stir bars. That way, in case you lose one, you've got a spare. The 2 large O-rings are the same diameter. One large O-ring goes down onto the deck. Next up is going to be your waste chamber. Find your 3 bolts for your waste chamber. Go ahead and populate those holes. This is where I was advising you folks to keep some of this grease handy. One thing that'll really save yourself a lot of trouble in future PMs is to take a small amount of this grease and apply to the heads of these 3 bolts that are sticking down in here. The reason being is these bolts are stainless steel, the deck is aluminum, and if you have a fluid leak, those 2 components can corrode together very easily, and it makes future removal very, very difficult. If you apply a small amount of grease, you'll prevent corrosion and you'll make your future PMs go way, way easier. Take your same 3/32 Allen wrench, tighten up your 3 bolts. They should go nice and smooth now that they've had fresh grease applied to them. And again, just like with the zipper pump housing, finger tight's good. You don't have to go crazy. So at this point, go back down here to your tubing, find your outlet side for Cal 1B. You remember A's on the left, B's on the right. So we'll do it in order. A's on the left and B's on the right. And then tuck them into this nice little cutout that's made on the deck. Go back up, get your second large O-ring, nest it into the top of the waste chamber. Take your sample chamber. Oh, I almost forgot it, just like Ben was advising earlier. Please remember this small O-ring on your temperature sensor. It's a very easy one to miss, very easy one to forget. So just set it on the end of your temperature sensor. Reinstall temperature. Nest sample chamber back into place. Find your 3 thumb screws. 1, 2, 3. Last part for your sample chamber, take your stir bar, tear open the stir bar packet. Now, I've seen a few different ways that people try to install the stir bar. I'm going to show you the way that I found to be the best. Your results may vary. If you have a different way that you like to do that's better than this, by all means, proceed. This is where your tweezers come into play. So what I like to do is I'll pick up the magnetic stir bar, hold it by the tweezers, and then I will simply go in through the sample chamber through probe A, line it up in the middle of that sample chamber, and simply let it go. The magnetic attraction between the top of the stir motor and the magnetic stir bar will just let it drop out and it'll nest right into place. So now we need to clean up the electrodes and replace the sample needle. And both of those can be done quite easily. On this electrode, you'll notice the membrane's gone, so that's kind of helpful. So you take a small amount of rubbing alcohol, dose it, and then blot it dry. What you're looking to do is you're looking to remove any potential remains of an old membrane that might be stuck to the face of that electrode. So you'll blot it dry. And if you have some DI water handy, you want to rinse it with DI water. Here's our A's on the left, so here's probe A. You'll notice that the probe housings have a small cutout, so you can get in here with a pair of tweezers or some other small object, maybe a paper clip, and you can just pop it out. Repeat as you did with the first probe. You want to make sure to get all of the IPA off of these electrode faces. The reason being is our membranes do not like IPA. The membranes will disintegrate almost instantly if they're exposed to IPA. And obviously, if you don't have a membrane, then the device is not going to work. Take out your membrane packet. This is again where you want to prepare yourself to make life a little easier. You can see on this one, these 2 caps are gone because I've already used those. That's a personal habit I got into a long time ago. I like to open up the membrane itself. I'll tap it a couple times to make sure it's free. Hopefully not drop it like I just did that one. Get out your sodium chloride, put about 3 drops onto the top face of that electrode. I'm trying to do this in a way that can be seen by the camera. This is backward from how I normally do it. Let the membrane fall out of the membrane housing and then use the backside of the membrane holder to snap it into place. Then you can reinstall. And obviously you're going to do the same with this one. I don't have a membrane installed on that one on purpose, just for sake of time. So now we have the sample needle, which I just misplaced. Here it is. The last bag we have remaining is your sipper tube pack. I call it the sample needle, either way. What you want to do is you want to unscrew this black cover off the top. Phillips head screwdriver, very straightforward. Take it off, set it to the side. Loosen up these 2 screws. Probably sees it better this way. Loosen up these 2 screws that hold the needle into place. Take these all, I suggest taking these all the way out, make your life a little bit easier. Again, they're very tiny, so just make sure you set them somewhere where you can find them. Lastly, this is the one that some people face a real challenge with. There's a threaded black plastic cone right here. This should just unscrew with fingertip pressure, just like this. Sometimes you'll encounter one that doesn't want to unscrew with finger pressure, and that's where your pliers come in handy. So what you'll do is you'll reach around that plastic housing with your pliers and unscrew it this way. We're at 11:44, we're doing great. Once you have this, once you have everything unhooked, you can see this tubing just draws through the back side and then pulls out. This can be discarded. Find your new sample needle. You can see it's already assembled. Thread it through both of the mounting brackets. Sometimes easier said than done. If you encountered this black cone that was very difficult to remove, again, get the last little residual part of your silicone grease, apply some silicone grease to these threads. You don't need a lot. Wipe your hands off when you're done. Put this back up in and reinstall. Again, finger tight is all you need. You don't have to go crazy. You don't need pliers or vice grips or anything like this to tighten this up. Find your two mounting screws, or I'm sorry, your two retaining screws. Very critical point here, when you're tightening these up, these only need to be finger tight. If you tighten these more than finger tight, you will damage the sample needle, which will cause fluid detection problems when you try to turn the device back on and run. And you get bonus points when you drop the screw like that and it disappears. It's my favorite as a mechanic, is losing things like that. All right. Another thing that this thing's challenging me right now, you want to have this sample needle going straight down the center of this armature. Right now it's kicked off toward the rear of the instrument. If you have it kicked off toward the rear of the instrument, that also can cause fluid detection misfires. So there we are. That's just finger tight, and then repeat with the rear. Finger tight, find your black cap and reinstall it. And one of the last parts before we're finished, this free end of the tubing has to go through a small hole that's back here on the back of the zipper armature. If you don't route the tubing through this hole, the tubing can actually get wrapped up inside of this armature and cause all kinds of mechanical problems and error codes and things like that. So just take the extra few seconds and route it through the proper way. Now this free end, you might remember on your zipper pump housing, we put the buffer tube onto the rear outlet. This one goes onto the front outlet. Like so. Now, believe it or not, we're almost done. Put your panel back on. Find your bolts that you just took off. We're going to pretend the bolts are on there because I misplaced them in the essence of time. Ah, Ben found them. Thank you, Ben. Use your 7/64 Allen wrench to put the two large bolts back in. Finger tight will do. Lastly, get your bottle caps out of your bleach water solution. Make sure they're rinsed. Put them back into the appropriate bottles. Put the screw lids on place. For your fluid detection cables, these gold colored cables, you'll notice that the connectors on the back wall follow the same orientation as the actual bottles themselves. There's also a picture in the user manual that shows which connection goes where. For posterity, this is waste, this is buffer, this is Cal B, and this is Cal A. So make your appropriate cable to your appropriate connection. And these just thread into place, again, finger tight. Lastly, you should have, now that we're almost finished, we should have 3 tubes remaining, 3 free ends. And if you look at this one, it says B1. That's for your buffer bottle. B is for buffer. Then we have Cal 1A and Cal 1B. And as I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing me say by now, A is on the left, B is on the right. You are now done with the mechanical part of the PM. Now it's time to turn the device back on and align all the targets and pump fluid through it and get it ready for sampling. Back to you, Ben.
Fantastic, fantastic. Excellent, thank you, Jason. Here's some things that we look at right after the end of it. Again, I want to have some follow-on tips. And immediately after that, we're going to go to some Q&A. I see a lot of fantastic questions on here that we're going to stick around and answer a few for you. Any that we don't get to, oh yes, go.
One
Go for it.
thing that I forgot to mention, I was talking about hooking up tubing. I forgot to hook up my waste tubing in the video.
Ah, would you like,
So,
let's
yeah,
show that real quickly.
Let's show that real quick. Sorry about that, folks.
There we go.
Okay, so this is the waste tubing. You may remember a few minutes ago, I put it inside the waste bottle. It just goes into this large diameter fitting right here on the side of the waste chamber. And again, it's just push to connect. That's all. Sorry for the trouble.
Yeah, you definitely want to make sure your waste tubing's connected. Make a pretty big mess otherwise. Here's some things that you want to do immediately after that. You want to make that you're sure that your screws on the zipper needle are not over tightened. Can sometimes cause an issue where it will crush down too much. You can see in the photo here, if you over tighten that, it'll crush down into the board below that, and you don't want that. It could tell you that you're always detecting fluid, and that's something we want to avoid. You also want to check for any errant moisture. That's typically not an issue, but if you have some sort of media that has a lot of bubbles or foam, it could stick to the end and it could be giving you a false positive. Now, if the membranes are unable to break in after you've done all of this, you want to assure that you've added the stir bar. First of all, I see that, or I have seen that very, very frequently, where the number doesn't change, and that's simply because the stir is not in there performing that action and giving us the signal we need. And if that does not work, then you may have to adjust your stir speed. In tech support, we always say turn it up as high as you can until it starts jumping all over the place like crazy, and then bump it back a few steps so it does slow down. You want it to be fast, but not jumping. That being said, we're at the point now where we can answer some of the questions. We have some fantastic questions that have come in today, and I would love to answer as many as I possibly can. Some of them we may not be able to get to in the interest of time, but we will be sure to answer all of them that we can. Here's a good question. Is 70% isopropyl alcohol still an acceptable cleaning or flushing agent? For cleaning, yes. I would not use it for a flush, though. I would use the 1% hypochlorite solution when you do your flush. I think isopropyl can cause some issues with the tubing. I don't know if it discolors it or if it damages it, but it's not ideal. I would use the hypochlorite solution when we do that.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, I want to make sure. I like to get the panel involved. Let's see. We have somebody who said, I get near 30 nanoamps on my sucrose membranes, would usually not reach 5 nanoamps for a while. Well, to be clear, we want to hit at least, that's our bare minimum. And if we're not hitting that, then we want to bump that up, or then we have to start looking for replacement. It's when it loses that signal, it gets under 5 nanoamps, then we start to worry. So it sounds like you're doing the right thing. We usually run known solutions and make sure our sugar values are reading in range. If our values are off, then we usually go ahead and change that membrane. That is a very good way to do it. That is exactly what I would do. Because a lot of times we have a recommended use that you can use them. And usually once they get over that, they will start to lose some of the linearity. You definitely want to start checking at that point. And if you get off of range with your linearity checks, absolutely, it's time to switch that one out. Let's see. Cody has more of a comment. It looks like I've noticed the area where the O-ring for the module sits is completely dry. It helps seat more properly and less likely to leak.
Absolutely true.
We have confirmation. Great. Would it be possible for you to share the presentation with us? Yes, this one will be shared afterwards. We're going to make it available. And everybody who's signed up today should get an email following up, and we will give that to you when it is available. Thanks. Can you provide a list of PM kit numbers for each model of YSI analyzer? I don't have those memorized, but we can certainly get a list to you. Do you have them memorized?
I know 2 of the 4. So there you go. The 2900 is part number 2988. That kit also works in a pinch. It can work on the 2500 as well, but you're going to have a segment of leftover tubing that you don't need. So to each their own. And for the 2950, the PM kit is part number 527712. And I have no idea if we've made a different kit part number for the 2900C.
I don't believe we did. That should be the same one as the 29.
Yeah. If not, the 2900 kit will work for the 2900C.
That's right. Now, if you ever do have any questions, please consult your manual. It will tell you exactly the one. You can also go to YSI.com and look at the store page, and it will tell you which one to use as well for the appropriate instrument. This is a good question. Is there a method to say a probe is good or bad by looking at the surface condition, for example? Or is performance the only way one can tell the health of the probe? That's a multifaceted question. It's very hard to tell oftentimes because a good probe and a bad probe can often look the same. I would say that once you hit 3 years, then the potential that your probe could be the problem enters, but it usually isn't. We've seen probes that are 5, 7 years old that work perfectly fine. Now, if you do see that it's discolored, if it's brown or black, that is what happens to silver when it oxidizes. It's tarnishing, but that rarely happens because there's almost always a membrane over it. So oxygen rarely ever reaches the surface of the membrane. So that's typically not what happens. Typically, it just gets old and you'll notice that the response gets slower. That's what I usually see there.
Yep.
Anything to add on that?
No, I would concur with what Ben is saying. What I noticed is when you have a probe that has a lot of hours or a lot of samples that it's experienced, sometimes you will have to change the membrane and then allow the device to sit sometimes overnight before the probe currents will be ready for calibration or running. And with that being said, I have seen an older device, one of the sister instruments to these things. I had one through here relatively recently that had probes that were over 20 years old. And after allowing the device to sit overnight with fresh membranes, it calibrated and ran perfectly. So difficult to predict.
Very difficult to predict, especially by sight alone. It's typically performance is the way that we can tell. But if it is brown or blackened, then that's very atypical. Something has probably gone very wrong if that's the case. Thank you for the question, though. This is a very similar question. Is it possible to see if a probe is defective? Not really. Only if it's more black or gray, potentially, but that's not a guarantee that it's bad or not. What's the part number for the plastic housing?
If you're talking honest to goodness, I don't remember. I don't have that one committed to memory, but I'm certain we can find out for you and get you that item number.
Yeah, absolutely. Contact us, and I didn't put tech supports at the end of this, but that is ysi.support@xylem.com. You will be able to contact them, and then we should be able to get you that answer. Getting it calibrated. This is, I think the question about calibrating is probably out of the scope of what we're trying to say here. We do have a lot of resources online where we can try to get you more of that information. And we do have videos to that effect. But for that one, I don't think we'll be able to do that one within the scope of time here. How do we remove the stir bar from the module? Well, if you take the module out, you can just tip it out and it'll fall right out. Otherwise, it can be a little bit difficult. It can be hard to get tweezers and get in there if you want to.
The easiest way is to let the sample chamber soak while it's soaking in hypochlorite. And then you can just simply take the chamber out and wrap it on its side after it's soaked for 15 or 30 minutes. And at that point, it'll usually fall out.
Excellent, excellent. How do you adjust the stir speed? That is in the service menu. You can go right in there. There's a stir bar speed section, and you can go right in there and adjust that to your heart's content. For cleaning, is 70% ethanol okay? I don't see why not. It's probably a more expensive solution, but it should work just fine for cleaning. Isopropyl alcohol or that should work just fine.
Nandini, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. We're happy to present it. Can I get parts for that's the old 2700, not any longer. The 2700 was our previous flagship instrument. It enjoyed many years of service. I think it's probably something like 35 years old at this time.
Something like that, yes.
It enjoyed a very, very long heyday, but unfortunately, the parts for that are no longer available. Let's see. If the instrument is used infrequently, how often should I perform a 6-month preventive maintenance? That's a fantastic question. Every 6 months is the answer. It's sort of like a car in many ways, where if you keep it running, then that's the ideal. That's what you want to do. It's better to keep it running. If you don't keep it running, then you get kind of the same problems you would if you didn't start a car very often and you let it sit. You get growth in the lines. You get things that happen that don't stop just because you're not using the instrument. I would say if you're having problems with an instrument and you haven't been performing those 6-month PMs, that's the first thing I would do.
And aside from, you can get contaminations growing in the line or in the sample chamber. Another thing that happens very easily if the machine sits dormant is the tubing sitting inside of the peristaltic pump will actually get compressed. And then when you go to use it a month later or 2 months later, then the tubing is compressed and it's not flowing fluid anymore. So even though you haven't ran the instrument, it's going to need a PM because the tubing's damaged.
Perfect. Yes, thank you for that answer too. Well, I think we've hit up the end of time. There's so many good questions. I don't think we can quite get to all of them, especially the ones that are more in depth, but it's giving us good ideas for more that we can give to you. Do you have anything else?
Kyle
Okay.
Hewer's question, very easy. This is a quick and easy one. The probes on a new unit, there should be a label on each probe showing A versus B. The probe part numbers themselves are identical, so you just have to make sure that you keep A in the left and B in the right.
Great.
Yep, yeah, they're the same color, same description, same everything.
Perfect. That being said, that's what we had for today. Thank you for all your questions. We'll have a follow-up email where we will give you all this information as Heather kindly put in the chat. If we have any questions that we could not follow up because it would take more time, we'll get into that as well. And beyond all else, thank you for joining us today. Keep your eye on the inbox. As Heather said, we'll send out a recording so you can reference this later. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good holiday season. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Keep an eye out on your inbox for the link to the recording and any more information. Thank you.